Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Situated between Russia and China, Mongolia is the world's most landlocked country. And yet, according to my guest today, this isn't a strategic weakness, but rather a competitive advantage. How has Mongolia managed to overcome its geographical limitations? And can it use this experience to punch above its weight in the geopolitical ring? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Damdin Tsogtbaatar, Mongolia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, we are recording this interview on the sidelines of the Valdai Forum, and many of the discussions here today are about Ukraine and how it's being sandwiched between Russia and the West led to a conflict. Mongolia also finds itself between two great powers, Russia and China, and yet, from what I understand, it is a source of development rather than discord. How do you explain that?
Well, we're developing a balanced relationship with our neighbors, and it's our priority. With Russia and China, we have strategic partnership, and really it is a trust-based, confidence-based relationship. The most important thing is really the fact that you give priority to this relationship. You base your relationship on your strengths. Of course, we're different countries. That means we have differences. It doesn't mean that we do not have differences. But it's very important to manage those differences and to capitalize on your strengths.
But from what I understand, it took you some time to arrive at that perspective, because you said in one of the interviews that before Mongolia used to view its landlocked status as a limitation. Yeah. What allowed for that change of perspective and this new vision of being landlocked and having no access to the sea as something that you can actually gain from?
Yeah, you know, two things. Again, under the Law of the Sea Convention, we have the right to access the sea. And our neighbors, due to our very good neighborly relationship, which is of strategic nature, we're having no problem with our access. And that strength of international law, we should be also using fully, which means it is, you know, in dealing with our two very big neighbors, still we're also using their goodwill plus international law as well. That's one thing. Secondly, these two markets themselves are very big markets. For example, China is one of prime, you know, export markets of Mongolian commodities. Russia is also a very big market, but yet we're buying more from Russia than selling, and that we're outlining it in our discussions with our Russian friends. We're telling them honestly our problems, that we don't like this deficit and this has to be changed.
But I assume you tell them that not in a way that, for example, the current administration of the United States tells its trade partners.
Well, what I really think is that we're using all our, instruments that are in our disposition, which means long-standing, friendly history of cooperation. And therefore, when we are communicating this sort of messages of ours, we really meet also understanding. On the other hand, our trade with our neighbors is beneficial to our neighbors as well. It creates jobs in the adjacent provinces and regions of our neighbors. So it's not that it is not an unfair relationship. We're talking about mutually beneficial relationship.
You're being very positive, but and the Russian-Chinese relationship in public is all about smiles and handshakes, but behind closed doors, the two can be pretty tough negotiators. And I've heard many stories in Moscow of how inexorable the Chinese were when negotiating the price of gas with the Russians. I'm sure there are many other examples as well. Are you sure that either of them is not using or not trying to enlist your country as a leverage against the other?
Well, you should ask them, but not us.
But you would know, you would be the first to know about that, I guess.
Yeah. What I really think is that it really is a trilateral relationship, which means it's not only about Moscow and Beijing, it's about us as well. And we're there. And our game is that to keep the balance. And it matters, because when we are saying that, look, here it's a little excessive, we're worried about the good thing is that we're telling, as strategic partners, there is an agreement to tell honestly the problems. So as you said, and as I said before, yes, I am positive, but I said we are different countries and therefore we have differences. Not everything is chocolate sweet.
Good to know. You said it's a trilateral relationship, a truly trilateral relationship, but wherever there is Russia and China, the United States is never too far away. What's your current state of affairs with Washington?
Very close, very close. And we just had a visit of our Prime Minister to the United States, and up until now we had comprehensive partnership. And now we have extended the level of our cooperation to an extended comprehensive partnership. So we're already making one move ahead in terms of advancing our relationship. And that really means, trade, technology, education, culture, we are, taking into our focus, and we are, on our policy-based decisions, we deliberately are working to expand them.
Now, the arrival of the Trump administration into the White House has changed the American relationship with many countries, both foes and friends, to the worse. Are you saying that Mongolia is a rare exception to that?
Everybody heard the speech of President Trump at the General Assembly. And he talked about principled pragmatism as the doctrine of the US policy. And the US is saying, well, we are requesting the countries of the world to respect their sovereignty. And in return, they will be respecting and working with them. They will not be trying to have other countries have certain types of, systems. It's their business. So you see, in other words, this principled pragmatism is, the way we also see the foreign policies of other countries as well. And therefore, we're really trying to catch the moments that are, positive, on which we can build the cooperation on a bilateral basis with our partners.
You're being very diplomatic, as I'm sure you have to be, but about a month ago, Mongolia, together with Russia and China, took part in the biggest military exercise to be held in Northeast Asia in more than 3 decades. And unlike other military drills, which usually focus on honing specific skills, the Vostok maneuvers were simulating a war scenario. Who could possibly threaten Mongolia with a ground war?
It's not about threatening or about threat, but it's about, if our neighbors...
But you talked about pragmatism.
Yeah,
I'm sure if you do something, you have a pragmatic reason for that.
Exactly. Therefore, we have our military. Doesn't matter how small it is, but a state has to have its own military. That's one thing. Secondly, if you have a military, they better be trained, and then they better be interoperable with their neighbors. Because, for example, due to our very long-standing relationship with Soviet Union then, and many of our military officers were trained in Russia, and then, many of our officers were pretty comfortable that, we know, Russian maneuvers, tactics, etc. But with time, we started, if you do not keep training,
absolutely,
you stay behind.
Minister, I'm sorry for interjecting, but my point that I made earlier was that it's not just any other military drill which usually focus on improving, enhancing the coordination and cooperation. Those maneuvers had a very specific scenario, a scenario of a ground war, which tells me at least that your partners and your neighbors, Moscow and Beijing, believe that that scenario is probable. Do you share that vision?
The military have their own way of thinking. And the military has to be ready for any kind of, activities. Possible activities. It would be naive to think that, it's very remote, it won't be happening. If you're in the business of building strategic thinking, you cannot afford to assume that something will not happen.
Now, Mongolia is very straightforward about wanting to grow all of the Russian-Chinese trade, but any benefit could be a liability, and both Moscow's and Beijing's relations with Washington are quite complicated right now. Are you fully insulated from the potential fallout from the bickering between both Russia and China on one side and the United States on another?
Of course, the risks are there. And therefore, we're really also trying to counterbalance this sort of risks. And therefore, we have third neighbor policy. And on the basis of that approach, we're building very strong ties with our third neighbors as well, so that in case of problems, we still have live, vibrant commercial relationship with other countries. So therefore, the risks are there. We really want this to stop. And we hope that at some stage, the parties will come to terms. Even in the countries with the most close relationship, there are differences. But if you really start only building and attending those differences and then attending them with negative approaches, then at times you don't solve the problems, but you exacerbate them. The important thing is that no matter how difficult it is, to keep the dialogue.
Now, let me ask you specifically about the Trump administration's intense focus on China's trade policies. One could make a case that if China's exports to the United States are inhibited, it may encourage Beijing to expand other markets even more. Could Mongolia be actually a beneficiary of the Sino-American trade wars?
Let me be very diplomatic here. We do not want to benefit on the loss of any of our partners. So we really want to keep our way of life, to keep this relationship with everybody. So therefore, I really think that they find common language. But in terms of China's position, they were, I think, this discussion over the trade deficit, it was there already long before. Even under Obama administration, and many administrations were talking about this trade deficit, right? So China was already anticipating that at some stage, this could come up. And my interpretation of their response is that this Belt and Road idea was already put in place back in 2013. And this was already in anticipation. In case something happens, they wanted to have other markets where they would be also supplying their products. Is that in case,
or do you think they would develop that initiative regardless of their relationship with Washington?
Of course, they would have done it regardless of that. But still, I think they were aware of this sort of things. That's one thing. Secondly, Central Asian economies, this frontier economies were coming out of crisis. They were new markets, and they provided new opportunities for their goods and services. So naturally, as you say, with or without these new problems, they would have been already dealing with it, and opening up these new markets and ensuring access of their products and services.
Minister, we have to take a very short break now, but we will be back in just a few moments. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Worlds Apart with Damdin Tsogtbaatar, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia. Minister, Mongolia is a rare example in Asia of a country that gets along with pretty much all its neighbors near and far. And I heard a number of American experts, for example, from the Brookings Institution, suggest that because of that, it may serve as Geneva or Helsinki of the East. Is that your intention?
We wouldn't mind, but we do not have this sort of established goal of becoming one. You know why? Because If you don't, you'll get the frustration. So you better not end in that sort of situation. What we have, we're a Buddhist country. What we have is already pretty good enough for us. We do not really want to be this host of many things, but if the countries choose Mongolia, we really don't mind.
And yet, just the other day, Mongolia issued an invitation to Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, to visit your country whenever he finds suitable, and that coincides with the prospect of a second meeting between the North Korean leader, the American president, and apparently there is a search for the most convenient location for that. What do you think Ulaanbaatar can offer that Singapore wasn't able to provide?
Singapore is a great place and they could provide everything. So we're not in this sort of competition. We can provide something more, etc. No, Mongolia's objective is very simple. This world peace order, and especially the peace in our region, is the most fundamental capital we have so far. And we're benefiting from it. And we really do not want to be these free riders of this, great value that we have. So we really want to contribute to the strengthening and consolidation of peace to the extent that we can. So therefore, as long as these peace talks are in place, no matter where it happens, it's already good enough for us.
With all due respect, I think you're being very modest, because I see Mongolia foreign policy as a little bit more proactive than you described. For example, back in 2013, your then president, was the first head of state to visit North Korea after Kim Jong-un took power, and you maintained a pretty good relationship with that country ever since. Can you give any advice, for example, to the Americans or other members of the international community of how to engage North Korea productively?
Our relationship with North Korea did not come about yesterday. North Korea's history of this state is 70 years. We are one of very few countries that has 70 years of history of diplomatic relationship with them. When Pyongyang was being bombed to the ground, our ambassador, most of the ambassadors were leaving, and one of few ambassadors that stayed there, to show the solidarity was a Mongolian ambassador. They never forget that. So during Korea War, there were many orphans, and although Mongolia is a small country, but with all our heart, we tried to help them, and we brought many Korean orphans to come and stay in Mongolian families. So already we have family relationships. So the relationships are very deep and very long-standing. And on the basis of this, we are really communicating with the North Koreans, and we're really trying to also bring across the idea that denuclearization is a much better option, and in this there is no double standard or hypocrisy. We are nuclear-free status country. So we're telling, well, that's what we are. And this policy is working for us. And we're trying to communicate, this denuclearized, situation may contribute much better to their security than the nuclear, programs.
Well, the United States clearly is not approaching North Korea in the same fashion, with the same emphasis on humanitarian affairs. What is it about the American approach to North Korea that you think is not working?
I think so far the approach is working.
Was working?
Yes.
You mean the Trump approach of threatening first and then pulling back? Is that a good
these are also
way to address it?
Yeah, these are also diplomatic, tactics. Diplomatic negotiations are very long, process. So, in fact, they were tried to approach from a different angle by the previous administrations, and on the basis of that experience, this administration knows that, okay, this approach is not quite working. Now let's try something else. And then they're approaching with this different approach. It was pretty daring approach, actually. And it really faced a lot of criticism in Washington as well. But yet, they dared to go ahead with that. And now we have these talks. I mean, all that North Korea, as far as I remember, and I've been in this policy for quite a long time, and the North Koreans were saying that we want to sit down with the Americans and talk. And this was not happening. Now it's happening. So it's a move ahead.
Now, North and South Korea have just agreed to begin reconnecting rail and road links, something that was met with concern in the United States. Americans are fearing that this may undermine the current sanctions regime. Do you see that as a kind of a bad cop, good cop routine, or do you think there are genuine disagreements between Seoul and Washington on how to approach North Korea?
A very important factor in the change of situation was this new policy of the South Korean administration. That thawing of relationship between South and North was a very strong impetus and basis for the U.S.-North talks. And therefore, I think both South Korea and the U.S. are in very close communication. And it's not secret. I mean, everybody knows this. And this, negotiation is being carried out in synchronized efforts. So I'm sure there are consultations going on.
Whenever North Korea is mentioned, the issue of human rights usually comes up. And I know that you served as the chairman of the Parliamentary Subcommittee on Human Rights. I assume this issue is near and dear to your heart. How do you think the international community should approach that subject when it talks to North Korea?
You know, human rights institution, I think, is one of the most fundamental achievements we as human beings achieve. And at any cost, against anybody, this should be protected. We have this human instinct, actually, of protecting each other. Therefore, when there is, problem with human rights, you need to talk about them.
But I'm sure you know that there is very deep skepticism, at least in this country, that Western countries may be instrumentalizing the issue of human rights too much, exaggerating it when it is politically expedient, ignoring it when it's politically inconvenient. Do you think the current international discourse on human rights is genuine and productive in terms of actually addressing the subject?
I believe it's genuine. But of course, we're not in heaven. We're on planet Earth, and this place is not perfect. So I do not rule out there are certain problems, right? But in general, just go around and ask, who does not agree with the supremacy of human rights? Everybody would agree. Which country does not protect its own citizens? All the countries, including the country we were just talking about, they would be claiming that we're protecting our citizens. This fundamental interest in protecting human rights is pretty genuine. But when it comes to the real implementation, there could be problems. And whenever these problems are, we should be one by one settling them. But we should not be really trying to make it perfect right away. That will cause a lot of mess.
Mongolia had its own transformation from a socialist state to a capitalist state. Looking at North Korea, what do you think presents a greater danger to the region and to the world as a whole? Preserving the North Korean system in a state that exists right now, with its nuclear weapons, with its pretty repressive government, or perhaps the efforts to change it? What's a bigger danger, bigger risk?
The bigger risk is the continuation of nuclear policies and preserving nuclear weapons, or an attempt to keep it going on. That would be much bigger risk. The rest, as long as the region is peaceful, then the rest will be happening as a result of interaction. Still, under the international law, under the UN Charter, the principles of sovereignty, independence are the fundamental, norms of international law. But through interaction, I think there will be certain reforms and changes. And especially now, Chairman Kim Jong-un is talking about focusing more on the economy. And they already made their party decisions to focus more on the economy. Focusing more on the economy from our own experience, from the experience of Russia, Mongolia, we all lived in socialist society. If you want to change your economy, there will be reforms and changes. It will be just necessary.
Well, Minister, I have to thank you for you being very generous with your time, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
I encourage our viewers to keep this conversation going on our social media pages, and hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.